In that case, yes, we can start our afternoon session. And of course, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend, Elena Semino, to talk about what she's been doing and while Elena has been doing the work. And to be perfectly honest, I'm really interested to find out what she's been doing. And as you can see, she's been working with a team of colleagues, Lancaster, Leeds and UCL.
Here they are.
Here they are. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Elena, who shall answer the question, quo vadis.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, right. So I'll be talking about a corpus that has just been built of Victorian anti-vaccination material. And I've been slightly dreading this talk because I don't do historical work. I mean, those of you who know my work know that it's not historical. But I'm lucky to work with people who have a variety of kinds of expertise. And as part of a broader project on vaccination discourse, which I'll tell you something very brief about in a moment, we got interested in the consequences of the introduction of compulsory smallpox vaccination in the 19th century in England, and decided rather bravely to try to build a corpus that reflected the anti-vaccination movement. So first of all, I should acknowledge my colleagues. So the person who is most should take most credit for this is Derek Gatherer, who works at Lancaster and covers us both on the medical side and the historical side. I would have liked Derek to be here, but he can't be here, but he's online and can unmute himself because the chances are you'll have some questions that I can't answer, but Derek can. Chris Anderson was an intern, undergraduate intern, and he got us going. He started collecting the corpus. And all my other colleagues, linguists, some of you will know them, and Claire and Alice in particular, Claire Hardaker at Lancaster and Alice Dagnan at Leeds, have done a lot of analysis, or the preliminary analysis that we've done on the corpus. So it's very much a team effort, and I'm just here as the mouthpiece for the group. So what I'll be talking about is I'll tell you something very brief about the project, the broader project that this corpus is part of. And then I'll tell you a bit about the historical background of the introduction of the smallpox vaccine in the Victorian period in England and the anti-vaccination movement that was triggered by the introduction of that compulsory, I should say, vaccination. Then I'll introduce the corpus, how we built it, what it contains, and I'll give you we've only had it for a short while. So I'll give you an idea of how it can be used to look at anti-vaccination arguments in a way that complements the historical studies that are substantial or that already exist about that in that period. And we fully plan to make the corpus available. The current plan is that we are in the final stages of a paper introducing the corpus that this talk is kind of loosely based on. And then we're hoping that to launch the corpus when the paper comes out so that many people like you can use it. We certainly won't even manage to scratch the surface of it, given all the other things we promised the funder, and this wasn't one of them. So there we are. Okay, so this is part of a project called Quo Vadis, Questioning Vaccination Discourse. Credit to Claire Hardaker for coming up with the name. And this project was actually conceived of and submitted for funding just before the pandemic. And the reason why we did it was that vaccine hesitancy, defined by the World Health Organization as a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccination services. So vaccine hesitancy was declared by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 global health threats in 2019. So that was before COVID. And it was already well known that people's attitudes towards vaccinations are formed and negotiated in large part through discourse, including online discourse. So we were interested in that. But it is also the case that vaccine hesitancy has existed for as long as vaccines have existed. And so there's a historical dimension to this as well as a contemporary one. So the project applies corpus-based discourse analysis to the study of discussions of vaccinations, particularly childhood vaccinations. Then COVID came along and upset all our plans. But we started off wanting to look at childhood vaccinations, especially MMR and HPV. In corpora drawn from social media, we also had newspapers, but they've kind of fallen by the wayside as a consequence of COVID. They're just too much. But we were already planning to look at parliamentary debates, in the Hansard records, because there's discussions of vaccinations going all the way back. And then we decided, having considered the availability of material, to look specifically via the building of the corpus at the Victorian period. So the corpus I'll be talking about is the Victorian Vaccination Discourse Corpus, VicVaDis. So here we are. So here's the background, okay? And bear in mind, this is where, you know, I have a little bit of knowledge, but not as much knowledge as probably some of you have. And Derek will help me if you have any questions. So smallpox was a highly infectious disease, and it had a very high mortality rate, 30% or more. In 1721, in England, a process called variolation was introduced, which is a precursor to vaccination. But the difference with variolation was that you were inoculated with the material, the substance from a smallpox pustule. So you were basically infected with the original illness, but in a way that would ideally stimulate an immune response so that when you encountered it again, you wouldn't get sick. And then very famously, Edward Jenner in 1796, building on things that were already around, successfully tested the idea of, instead of using the lymph from smallpox pustules, to use the lymph from cowpox pustules, because cowpox was a similar disease but milder. And actually the observation at the time was that people who worked with cows, especially milkmaids, seemed to be immune against smallpox. And so, and I said this idea was around, it was also in Asia, sort of Jenner didn't quite sort of invent it out of the blue. But in 1796, he inoculated an 8-year-old boy who was the son of the gardener. Ethics wasn't a thing at the time. And that was successful. I'll tell you a little more about that. And then 2 years later, he published the inquiry into causes and effects of the variola vaccine, where he introduced the technique, which came to be called vaccination, from Latin vacca, cow, because the lymph came from cows. And so here the idea is it was less risky because you were inoculated with infectious material for a less dangerous illness, cowpox as opposed to smallpox. But it turned out that being immunized against cowpox also protected you against smallpox. So little James there was inoculated first, as far as I know, and then they challenged him with smallpox. So first he was inoculated with cowpox, then they exposed him to smallpox, and luckily James was all right. And then the thing progressed from there. I think I remember reading about challenges with COVID vaccines, that challenge studies where very young and healthy and fit people would volunteer to be vaccinated first and then exposed to the virus, but I don't think James has any choice in the matter. Anyway, so Jenner is credited with saving many lives, right? Because smallpox really killed a lot of people. And it was eventually declared eradicated in 1980, so that the younger people in this room, you would not have got the smallpox vaccine, but the older people in this room, we got it still, because we're ancient, and in those days, it was still a thing. Okay, so this is the kind of background. And then basically what happened was, here's a series of dates to contextualize the situation in the Victorian period. We just end up slightly outside the Victorian period at the end. So in 1840, variolation, the one with the actual smallpox thing, became illegal in England and punishable, and free vaccination was introduced for the poor. And the poor and poor laws are kind of in the background to all of the stuff that I'll be talking about. And then this is an important date because you see that it's the start date of our corpus collection. In 1853, there was a Vaccination Act, one of a series in the following 50 years or so, that made vaccination against smallpox compulsory for babies by the age of 3 months. And parents could be fined or imprisoned. In subsequent years, various vaccination acts also dealt with how many times you could be fined. So do you just get fined once, or you just get fined every time somebody notices that your child is not vaccinated? And of course, for the poor, this was a big deal at the time. So there were various other, I won't give you all the vaccination acts, but basically from in the subsequent decades, various league societies against compulsory vaccination formed in England. And bear in mind, it's the compulsory element in particular, as well as the vaccination element that they focused on. There were many marches and protests, including one in Leicester, which apparently attracted 100,000 people who marched against compulsory vaccination. So bear in mind, they couldn't organize on Twitter or at the time. It was an enormous number, but there were many others. And in 1889, for 7 years, there was a Royal Commission on Vaccination trying to sort out all these issues to do with penalties, with fines, with compulsion and what to do. But the wind was beginning to change because towards the end of the century, compulsory vaccination was politicized. And in 1896, a Liberal candidate from the National Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League won a by-election in Reading on a ticket that included being anti-vaccine, anti-compulsory vaccination. And so by the end of the century, in 1898, via the recommendations of the Royal Commission, vaccination was still compulsory, but a conscience clause was introduced where the parents could object for conscience reasons to vaccination, and that sort of diminished the compulsion. And by 1907, again, vaccination was still compulsory, but opting out on the conscience clause became easier, and so by that point sort of marks the end of compulsory vaccination. And this is very interesting in a number of respects. I mean, I'm Italian. When I went to school, you had to be vaccinated to go to school. It was compulsory, and I think it will apply to other countries here. The UK has not had really compulsory vaccinations since then. It's recommended. And of course, during COVID, there was the issue of certain people in certain professions only being able to keep their jobs, especially in social care and healthcare, if they were vaccinated. And that caused a lot of opposition. There was also stuff about going to nightclubs, but the job stuff was more important. And in the end, it was watered down. So the compulsory issue is really quite interesting. Okay, so lots of people have worked on this, but they've worked on it on the basis of a manual document analysis. So there's lots of interesting stuff that you can read, and there are overviews of the main arguments against compulsory vaccination from historians and others who looked at that period. And the main arguments were danger to health, including death, that vaccination is dangerous, threats to individual liberties, especially for poorer working class people who had to pay fines. So sometimes the anti-vaccination societies or leagues paid the fines for people who couldn't afford to pay the fines themselves. And then religious opposition to the use of animal products, because obviously you were vaccinated with material from cows on religious grounds and other grounds. This is just an overview of what is already known. So the availability of the corpus, what we're hoping is that it will give people another way to investigate that period. It's not as if we're discovering something that people didn't know about already, but we can do the kinds of things that you can only do if you've got a large corpus. Okay, so here credit to my colleagues. So we started off with Chris, our undergraduate intern, fantastic guy, and he's doing a PhD with Gavin now, who basically we heard him in the summer of 2021, and he said, well, why don't you, as part of this internship, look at what there is? And he started finding documents preserved as PDFs from that period. So he did a first survey, and he was able to see that there is stuff. There was stuff that we might be able to use to build a corpus. And then Chris's internship finished, but Derek picked up the baton and spent a lot of time looking at what exists. And a wide variety of things exist. I've listed them here, many technical, of course, there's academic literature, scientific literature, medical literature, etc. What we were interested in was stuff that ordinary people might be able to read. So we can't labor at this point, but we wanted to have, if you like, the closest equivalent we could find to social media of the time, stuff that was available. It wasn't stuff that was just for a professional audience. So we've ended up with a corpus of just over 3 million tokens, 134 documents, and 66 authors. Authorship is really complicated because sometimes we have anthologies, and then sometimes the author is an anti-vaccination league, so you don't know exactly who wrote things. Derek looked at three main archives first: the Wellcome Collection Library, Project Gutenberg, and the Online Library of Liberty. And then he also subsequently looked at an existing catalogue of anti-vaccination literature, which is over there, by the London Society for the Abolition of Compulsory Vaccination, which was active at the time, to see whether we'd missed anything. And he complemented the corpus with that. I should say from the start, of course, like any corpus, especially historical corpus, it may be that over time people find stuff that we could add. So hopefully this will become a more open enterprise, but this is where we are now. So in terms of our inclusion criteria, we wanted things that were focused on vaccination. And if there were longer books, they had to be primarily on vaccination, not having vaccination as a kind of small topic, and harder to operationalize in principle, but in practice quite clear even from the title that they had an anti-stance. In fact, there wasn't an enormous amount of pro, because vaccination was compulsory. It was the establishment that dictated it. So most of the literature is anti. The time period is between the Vaccination Act in 1853 that introduced compulsory vaccination, and just before the Vaccination Act in 1907 that made it easier to opt out. So, and that is the kind of key period for the anti-vaccination movement. The Vaccination Acts that we're looking at apply to England and Wales, but all of the documents we have are from England, and so that's what we're focusing on. Scotland followed just behind, but it had a different slightly different approach. In terms of genre, as I said, we try to operationalize the idea of being widely accessible. So we've got pamphlets, newsletters, non-academic tracts and periodicals, and letters to newspapers. So at the time, a fair number of the population could read. Newspapers were sometimes made available in pubs so that people could read, and pamphlets were produced by all sorts of people who had the means to do it, as well as the societies, and were often handed to people for free. So this was the idea that things were accessible. Then there was the really difficult process that I would never have been able to do myself, and Derek spent months doing this, of trying to convert PDFs written as they were at the time into machine readable text. And here, someone more knowledgeable than me could give you the whole spiel. Derek tried various OCR conversion approaches to see how well they worked on the material that we had, and ended up deciding that Adobe Acrobat gave us the best success rate. And we had a threshold that we needed at least 70% accuracy in conversion for a document to be included in the corpus. This is not an exact science. There are PhDs and papers on this, but that's basically how we did it. What we excluded pro-vaccination material, stuff that wasn't in English, fiction and drama, and the technical publications, which we thought would be a different project to look at the academic writing of vaccinations as opposed to writing for a general public. So here's an example of the conversion process. So here's the historical dispersion of texts in the VicVaDis corpus. Now, basically, I give it to you as information. We can't really read much from this because the mean number of documents per year is 2 point something. In some years we have 9, but basically this reflects what we could find that we could convert reasonably accurately with OCR. That's about it. We can't say, well, in that year there are lots because such and such happened, although maybe that is the case, but we cannot know because of the fact that there will be many texts that won't be available anymore. It's what we found that met our criteria. Okay, so as I said, the idea is to make this corpus available in as widely as possible in the next months or a year at most. And in fact, if anybody, we already know where we would like to make it available, but you guys might have ideas about the best places to make it available, given that we want as many people as possible to use it. And what we've done so far is just an initial exploration to see how we can use this corpus to look at anti-vaccination arguments, and also, as much as we can, compare them and contrast them with contemporary 21st century anti-vaccination arguments. We should bear in mind that we have a different historical period. We have a period where vaccination was very different from now, in the sense that it wasn't until about 50 years after the end of our corpus that you were vaccinated with a liquid that kind of was kept under, was produced in different circumstances. People were vaccinated with the lymph from the pustules, and it was compulsory for babies, and there were punishments and penalties. So it's very different from the situation we have now for any vaccine. Nevertheless, there are parallels with the anti-vaccination arguments. Okay, so I'll show you two approaches to the exploration of the corpus. One is via the concordance and collocation tools in Sketch Engine. And specifically, I needed a starting point. We needed a starting point. The lemma vaccination seems like a good starting point for this. It happens to be the most frequent open class word in the corpus, and it occurs, at least according to Sketch Engine, just over 28,000 times. So we looked at the collocates of vaccination within a window of 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right, and ranked according to log dice. On the next slide, you have the top 20 open class collocates. So I've removed the closed class words. So I'll let you have a look. First, there aren't that many surprises, as you wouldn't expect with collocates. You've got references to the illness, your references to child. Doctor is usually Dr. Jenner or another doctor. Disease, etc., etc. The ones I've decided to look into more depth into are the top collocate compulsory, because that was the real main thing that caused the anti-vaccination movement, and what is different from today. It wasn't the only thing, but it was a major thing. Then also I looked at case, because partly it gets you into the associated side effects or vaccine harms alleged to apply to the vaccination, then death and disease as potential vaccine harms. And then there's a bunch of collocates that are to do with cause-effect relationships. Effect, follow, cause, and result. So those are now I'm going to take you through each of those collocates, a group of collocates, to see what we can see at an exploratory level. The idea very much, and the way we're writing the paper, is that ideally this first study is meant for anybody. So a historian who has already looked at this, but actually wants to do a bit more, should be able to use the corpus and use available free software, not Sketch Engine, but the paper uses AntConc, in order to go a bit deeper or explore particular things. So that's the general idea. Okay, so let's have a look at compulsory vaccination. So if you look at compulsory as a collocate of vaccination, you find a bunch of different arguments that relate to the literature in this period, and that sometimes might go a bit further. So one objection was that vaccination was against nature. And actually there is something to do with that too in the contemporary world. So this compulsory vaccination, which is a wanton outrage upon nature, a stupid blunder of man, betrays also an unaccountable blindness, ignorance, or entire suppression of wrong, not human slaughter, but by the application of the powers of nature to the improvement of mankind. So vaccination as unnatural is something that is one of the themes in the corpus. And of course, it still applies today to some extent, especially the idea that was very much present around in the COVID period, that it was better to get the illness than to get the vaccine. And of course, COVID is more complicated than that because most of us had both, but it was an argument. Then there was the argument about effectiveness, okay, that was ineffective. So the compulsory vaccination laws came into operation in 1854, and you would naturally expect that there would be a continuous decrease in mortality. What are the facts? In 1858, 61, 64, and 67, the deaths from smallpox were, and they went up respectively. So Pickering was somebody who was very active at the time. He had an anthology that is the longest text, I think, in our corpus. And one of the things I'm not competent to comment on how accurate this might be, but what you can see is something more generally, something that happens today. There's a lot of disagreement about numbers. And the word statistics will come up later. But one of the arguments was that there was no evidence that it was effective. Another argument it was a distraction. And where it was a distraction, the claim was made that you could avoid smallpox by living in a clean, hygienic way, that you didn't need to be vaccinated, right? This will come back again. The only efficient prophylactic against disease, whether smallpox, fever, etc., is to be found in enlightenment and faithful compliance with the laws of life and health, which these compulsory vaccinations laws by teaching people to trust in vaccination and leading them to believe that they may nourish with impunity the real causes of smallpox, set utterly and daringly at defiance. So basically the idea was you could avoid smallpox by living in a particular way. And if people were vaccinated, it would make them complacent and they would live in unhealthy ways. And actually, we've been doing a lot of work on the HPV vaccine. So HPV, the HPV virus is transmitted primarily through sexual contact. And so it has an association with sexual promiscuity. So even though it helps to prevent cervical cancer in women and also some cancers in men, it has a relatively low uptake. It's given in pre-adolescence. And one of the arguments is just don't have too much sex with too many people and you can avoid HPV in that way. So there's a very similar argument. And also the argument, some parents say, if my child is vaccinated against HPV, they're going to go and have sex in the same way as this, right? And this is the vaccine that prevents cancer, right? So there is definitely a parallel. And then inconsistent versus other causes of death. And we've had something similar with COVID. The government decreased compulsory vaccination because many people die of smallpox. But enormously more die of overeating. Then why not 155 compulsory limitations of food? Many die of smallpox, but enormously more die of evils that ensue from the common cold. Then why not compulsory flannel waistcoats and compulsory nightcaps? So here these analogies, but they're still made, these analogies, you know, why do you obsess with this and you make it compulsory and you don't do anything about the other causes of death? So by looking at compulsory as a collocate of vaccination in the corpus, you find a whole bunch of different arguments against vaccination, some of which are reminiscent of what we see today. And then we looked more specifically at the string compulsory vaccination is, and that is where you find all the references to threats to civil liberties. So here are just some examples from the concordance: a tyranny that everyone should strenuously resist, a great infringement on that freedom which every man has the right to enjoy, a disgrace to our jurisprudence, and a shameful intrusion upon the right to personal liberty, the largest infringement of that freedom ever yet exercised. And here, so we should say, as I say, the objections are to the compulsory nature of vaccination, and that is very different to what we have now. And you know, there can be more general sympathy for that argument, given the consequences, especially for poorer people. When we look at how people talk about how evil compulsory vaccination is, there are some very emotive metaphors now. Okay, it's no surprise to anybody who knows me that I'm interested in metaphor, but also contemporary anti-vaccination discourse uses emotive metaphors. They tend to work quite well as persuasive devices. Nowadays, there's a whole bunch of metaphors, many are Holocaust related. And obviously this were here before that time, but here's an example of a highly emotive metaphor to argue against compulsory vaccination. A wider and deeper and subtler social evil than universal compulsory vaccination is scarcely conceivable. On the physical side, universal pollution. On the side of manhood, womanhood, and childhood, with the several dignities, it is to the extent of its reach, degradation and extinction. The cradle, again, metonymy here, is born to an immediate medical hell. Politically, compulsory vaccination is an innermost stab of liberty, which, piercing its heart, will find its courage and heaven-born principle and convictions in other directions, an easy prey. State medicine can do what it likes with us. if we once let it do this. So this is the slippery slope argument as well. You know, if they do this, God, what else are they going to do to us? And that applied in the COVID period too. And again, you know, I'm presenting this. I'm not saying that these things are necessarily unreasonable or unjustified. I'm just looking at how they're expressed. Scientifically, science murders itself here. It defiles the whole world to make it sweet and clean. And the contrast between pure and impure is an interesting one in discussions of vaccinations generally, and in this corpus. We haven't looked at it yet, but there's the issue of clean living that will prevent smallpox. Then there is the issue of the vaccine introducing impurity into the body, and therefore being objectionable on religious grounds and other grounds. And again, there are parallels with contemporary vaccination, anti-vaccination arguments, that it introduces something, you know, a child is pure and perfect, and it introduces imperfection and impurity. This one is possibly an even more extreme metaphorical scenario where compulsory vaccination is the bloodhound of the childbearing woman and of the nursing mother, and adds a fresh and unnatural woe to the pangs of labor. So this is kind of, because babies had to be vaccinated before they were 3 months old. Here what we have is the idea that vaccination hovers like a raven behind the pregnant woman and then kind of pounces as soon as the baby is born. So this is very highly emotive. It is the most unmanly invention of the abyss where tyranny is at home. In Norway, at lambing time, the ravens sit on the parturient's sheep, waiting in its wool till the lamb is born, when they dig its eyes out with their beaks. So here, vaccine is compared to a bird killing a newborn lamb. Compulsory vaccination is such a raven, sitting comfortably upon the profitable wool of the parturient mother. That is to say, upon those mothers who are anti-vaccinators from religion, from conscience, from perception, from conviction. Over such, in the months of pregnancy, vaccination hovers. Anxiety and indignation are in the shadow of its wings. So you can see the emotive arguments, etc. And there is literature, contemporary literature, that emotive narratives are more successful, no surprises, but are more successful at persuading people against vaccination than pro. We've also looked at, so basically it is difficult to tell an emotive pro-vaccination narrative unless you're telling a narrative about the illness that the vaccine is trying to prevent. Because if you get vaccinated uneventfully, there's no good story. You just go, you get your vaccine, nothing much happens except a sore arm. It doesn't make a good story. Whereas damage and major side effects and vaccine harms make good stories, because negative material makes a better story. It's more tellable than uneventfulness, obviously. We got a paper on that related to HPV coming out soon. Okay, then the other colloquies, death. Many phrases when death occurs with vaccination is death from vaccination, after vaccination, following vaccination. And then there are many stories about specific individuals. So today we've heard a lot about narratives. There are many narratives about specific people. One medical witness, after describing the death of a child from vaccination, said that he asked the mother what the surgeon who performed the operation said about it. The woman's answer was, I dare not mention vaccination to him. He's very cross if I do. So this is all intertwined with social class issues, with who can speak to whom, whether a working class mother can object to something that the doctor is doing to their child. And then there are allegations of cover-ups in death certificates. And this is very similar to what happened with, did someone die with COVID, of COVID, etc. And the discussions of whether death certificates can be trusted are also here. In October 1876, an official inquiry was made concerning the illnesses through vaccination of 16 children in the Mississauga district of the Gainsborough Union, of which 6 proved fatal, but no mention was made of vaccination in any of the death certificates. So there are allegations of cover-ups, essentially, in death certificates. When it comes to disease, so when disease is a colloquy to vaccination, sometimes the disease is smallpox itself. And in our data, because our data was collected to be anti-vaccination, when disease is to do with smallpox, it's about the fact that the vaccine is not effective. There appears to be no positive security against the disease, either by vaccination or by smallpox inoculation. And I've seen several cases where the patient had caught smallpox twice, and at each time is severely marked, and in 2 instances have died of the second attack of smallpox. When disease refers to other illnesses, it's to do with the harm caused by vaccination. For every child that dies from smallpox, 40 die from diseases induced by vaccination. And here you can see that even though I cannot judge the validity of the claims, this seems slightly overblown, right? And this is LSACV here, sent from the London Society Against Compulsory Vaccination. It's one of the societies that was active at the time. Now, cases also takes you closer. So cases can be cases of smallpox, in which case it's again about lack of effectiveness. This professor from Kiel had 191 cases of smallpox, and 1/4 had been vaccinated. So we've seen it with COVID, right? If the vaccine doesn't protect you completely, then it's not worth it. So it's a similar argument. Otherwise, cases is followed by references to the illnesses that were alleged to be caused by the vaccine itself. Now, bear in mind, this was a different process of vaccination than we're looking at today. And even from my limited knowledge, and we're looking more in depth into this, here this ranges all the way from what you would expect as minor side effects, major side effects, catastrophic events, and stuff that really seems unlikely. So the most frequently mentioned disease is erysipelas, which I didn't know anything about, but it's a skin infection. There are many cases of this. That and a strong association. But if you look more broadly, this is just a small list of all the things that were associated to being vaccinated, all the way to tetanus, etc., and so on. So leprosy, etc. So some are the kinds of things that would be associated with sort of baseless claims of vaccine harms. Some seem plausible, some maybe have been rare. But here you get, the historical literature already tells you what the claims were. Here you can come up with a more complete list. And this, something similar happens if you look at the cause-effect words, cause-effect follow result. Here I've given you some examples that go beyond those illnesses, right? And they tend to be about individuals sometimes. Thoughtful dentists suggest vaccination as a probable cause of the early decay of teeth in this age. Now, we can imagine there are many other causes of this. The transmission from parent to offspring of an enfeebled constitution, the idea that the vaccine weakens you. And this is also something that is around still, the result of vaccination. And then we've got this man, Sir Colin Bradley, died from the direct effects of vaccination a few years ago. And this person is recorded even in Wikipedia as having died after being vaccinated. Of course, after being vaccinated, we've seen it with COVID. Is it cause effect or not? I don't know. And it must not be forgotten that the Queen, this is Queen Victoria, ran the risk of nearly losing her arm not long since through revaccination. And what would not surprise me to find in Prince Leopold's mysterious and long-continued illness would ultimately be traced to vaccination. So here you can see how the whole thing kind of broadens if you follow these cause-effect words. I'm nearly done. So there's a lot of work that you can do if you're corpus linguists of any variety with this, following up important words, following up collocations, etc. We also decided to see what we could get out of doing keenness analysis. So as many of you know, keenness analysis involves comparing two data sets in terms of the relative frequencies of words or semantic fields or parts of speech. And what we did, though, there's been some discussion already about, is there a bad reference corpus? But when you're comparing one corpus to another, ideally, the comparison corpus, the reference corpus, needs to be appropriate. So my colleague Alice Dignand scoured existing resources. Some of you may have other ideas. And she exploited the corpus of late modern English texts, previously compiled and available, that has 34 million tokens within that period, classified by genre, and included texts that were roughly from the period of our corpus. And again, in terms of genre, she decided to include treatises and letters and leave out fiction, narrative, non-fiction, drama, and others. So we got the reference corpus, VicRef, which is nearly 2 million tokens. So we got a contemporary, roughly similar corpus. So we did keyword analysis using W matrix. Those are the settings. I'll just show you the top 30 keywords. Again, keywords don't usually surprise you very much. They're not supposed to, but there are things that you can follow up. So the number one is here. So numbers are really interested in this corpus. And actually, I'm sure that there's a thesis to be done on the use of numbers in the corpus. What I decided to just give you a little insight is the word statistics, because somebody already alluded to statistics sort of beginning to take off in that period. And really, I'm completely unprepared to discuss it in any depth. But it's interesting that statistics is a keyword. And so here's the concordance of statistics. And that's what you would expect. There's bad statistics and good statistics and statistics that are not really to be relied upon, etc. Here's a quote. We often hear of the statistics of the anti-vaccinators, to which the summary answer is the anti-vaccinators have no statistics. Their statistics, this is an anti-vaccinator speaking. Their statistics are the statistics of the vaccinators, in which they provide the material for their own condemnation. So this reminds me a bit of facts and we have alternative facts. You know, there's our statistics and their statistics, etc., etc. I think that would be something really interesting for someone like you guys who knows that kind of discourse intimately, to see how these discussions were carried out and what the broader context was of discussing this. But it's very contemporary, this idea that, you know, discrediting each other's statistics. So same analysis at level of semantic domains. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, I used a semantic annotation tool that allocates each word to a semantic field. Here are the labels for the top 10 key semantic fields, so more frequent, relatively speaking, than in the reference corpus. And those are example words within those. Again, these things are not supposed to surprise you, and indeed you find what the whole thing is about. There's stuff to do with medicine and disease, etc. But look at numbers, right? Numbers are really high. There's top third key semantic domain. And then you find combined some of the things I've already talked about. Law and order, because the whole legal thing of who was enforcing the fines, etc., was really important. And then cleaning and personal care. So that business of hygiene being an alternative, good hygiene being an alternative vaccination, comes up as a key semantic domain. And then there's bad stuff, there's illnesses and so on. So in the same way as I did for statistics, I just wanted to look at cleaning and personal care, partly because we've been doing so much work, as I say, on the HPV vaccine. And we've been dealing with this thing that if a woman in particular has very few sexual partners, she doesn't need to be vaccinated. And here the argument is if you have a clean life, you don't need to be vaccinated. So one of the words that is at the top of the concordance lines for this semantic field is sanitation. Here's a concordance of sanitation, and here's an example. The vaccine is inexpedient because it concentrates attention on a safeguard proved to be insufficient in itself and leads to the neglect of sanitation and isolation, which our evidence shows to be more effective. So this idea that sanitation should be is a better alternative to the vaccination can be found here. So I'm done basically. So I've introduced this corpus, which I hope will be useful well beyond our project. In fact, because we didn't promise it to the body that funds our research, strictly speaking, we have no allocated time to look at it. Of course, we will try to do more on it, but the idea is to make it available so that others can carry out studies. And I'm just giving you an idea of what can be found, what a rich resource it could be if you look at it using corpus tools. And that's it. Thank you. So Hannah is going to unmute Derek. So Derek, you can take the questions with me. Yes. Just a second. Okay, I hope that works. If you're with us, Derek, give us a shout.
Yes, well, perfect. I can see it says live on the bottom of my screen.
We can hear you. We can hear you there. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so the questions now we've added Derek. So, are there any questions about it?
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, I don't know if you looked at the data posted yet. I know you touched on, reasons for hesitancy, like, the assaults on liberty or religious ideas. And I know, like, more recent, well, let's say the pandemic, you have, along with these things, you've had, in some circles, conspiracy theories come along with that, though. There's that term, the pandemic, that, it's the pharmaceutical industry to make a lot of money, so they release this virus on the world, or the government just using this as a reason to take away freedoms and turn it into a totalitarian state. Were there any conspiracy theories that were in circulation during this time?
Yeah.
Is it a Prussian plan or something like that?
I'm going to hand right over to Derek. Derek, I don't know if you heard the question, but the question is, was there any equivalent to today's conspiracy theories by the origin of the illness or the plan behind vaccination?
Well, there wasn't an equivalent of modern anti-pharma discourse because there wasn't a big pharma sector at that time, but there's definitely an equivalent conspiracy theory that insinuates that the whole apparatus of vaccination was effectively a money-making enterprise. So some of the texts draw attention to the amount of money that a vaccinator is paid per patient and so on. And we've seen some of that more recently with people that have drawn attention to some of the fees that have been paid to people who've been doing COVID vaccination. So there's a direct parallel there. And that's maybe the beginning of what we now see also as a big anti-pharma conspiracy theory that suggests that the companies that produce vaccines are just doing it to make millions of pounds every year.
Okay, that's great. And we were talking before this began about how there were very few new ideas. And that's another example of it.
Yes.
There we are, vaccination's born, the idea's born, and we've had it again since in that case. That's great.
Fascinating. With the themes that you saw and the parallels that you made, you've got a much wider temporal period than we've just had sort of the pandemic. Are those all present across all the periods, or do you see them sort of coming in waves?
In this period, or in this period, we haven't looked at enough detail, but partly it depends on. So I just gave you the first Vaccination Act and the last two, but there were some vaccination acts in the middle that, for example, introduced tougher and tougher penalties, and so then. And you could, if we could take that bar chart seriously, which of course we can't, but there is a kind of concentration in the 1870s when there was really intense debate about penalties and punishments and people not being able to pay the fines, etc., and how the fines were going to be basically in practice implemented, which is similar to contemporary debates about, okay, if it's compulsory, but how are you going to enforce it? So I think that those arguments, especially on the financial side, increased over time as a consequence of that. But other things, we haven't looked enough at the progression in the corpus to be able to tell you. But there is a kind of concentration in the 1870s of discussions of penalties and punishments and what is appropriate and how to deal with it.
And what are the kind of mechanisms for the equivalent of things going viral? Because with social media, with these kind of anti-vax things, very quickly a new idea can come into the discourse and then spread, and it's an extra tool in the anti-vax discourse.
Yeah, I haven't said, but Derek may be able to come in here. Certainly, I haven't studied the period enough to be able to answer the question. It is definitely the case that these pamphlets were widely available, and this actually predates this period. Pamphlets were produced very quickly and handed out very quickly. But the fact that there were very large demonstrations, because 100,000 people in Leicester, I don't know exactly what the population of England was at the time, is a hell of a lot of people if you can't sort of spread the word in other ways. So these societies were very effective in spreading the word. It would not have been as instantaneous as somebody tweeting something and being retweeted. Derek, I don't know if you've got anything to add on this.
Well, I think although of course there was no equivalent, there wasn't social media, obviously, as we understand it, but nevertheless, the equivalent was the speed with which you could reply to something with a pamphlet. And I notice on screen at the moment, if the slide is still on screen, just above the U of thank you, just above the exclamation mark, traveling immediately upwards and then slightly to the right, there's a pamphlet called Smallpox at Gloucester, a reply to Dr. Coupland's report by Walter Hadwin, and this came out in response to the almost immediately in response to the official report on the very bad outbreak of smallpox in Gloucester. It was virtually the last really serious outbreak in the UK, and so that could be produced very rapidly. So and I think that the anti-vaccination movement at the time did rely on rapid response. They got their letters off quickly to newspapers. They quickly wrote pamphlets. There's a certain amount of intertextuality, I think, if that's the right word, within the pamphlets, although I dare say that Alice or Elena might know a little bit more about exactly how much there is, but you do get the impression sometimes if you read a lot of them that giant chunks are being not obviously sort of cut and pasted, but copied out verbatim to make the point. So there's a sort of background library of set positions that can be quickly cobbled together, and then some more topical material can be added, and the new pamphlet can be out really quick to take advantage of something that's happened in the news.
Yeah, and actually, for those of you who are corpus linguists, Derek is absolutely right. So when I was preparing this talk and I was looking at the concordance lines, every now and again I found what looked like duplicates, and I thought, oh my God, we've got the same text twice, but it's not the same text twice. It's a later text copied a big chunk of a previous text, and so that we've got the same text twice, but it's two different sources. So clearly there was some rapid production and then repeat of text going around. Yeah.
Could I ask Derek a question? It's not something that we've set out to look at, but I'm quite interested in terms of the corpus compilation you've done. You've filtered out texts which didn't pass your OCR threshold. Mm-hmm. It'd be quite useful in that graph that you showed, where you have the spiky graph and
to look at the other one.
To look at that, because I know certainly with newspapers in the latter half of the 19th century, OCR is worse in some years than others because there were issues of paper production and ink production, and you get worse ink and paper in some years than others, and that leads to worse OCR. You get foxing, blurring, all these things. So it'd be quite interesting to overlay those two to see if the OCR decision is actually scrappy in some years. Not that you could do anything about it. No,
but I think, Derek, I'm sure it's possible because Derek had a meticulous record.
We tried to do something about the poor OCR quality. I mean, the percentage that Elena quoted actually is just due to a sort of ad hoc measure that I devised, which is that if a word after conversion into plain text has a non-alphanumeric character internal to it, then that indicates that it's become mangled somehow in the conversion process. So simply by counting the number of tokens that had non-alphanumeric characters internal to them, I was able to give a sort of percentage measure of words that had suffered adversely during the conversion. And we just set a threshold based on that, what we felt we could live with. Then what I did was I decided to see if I could locate some of the commonest errors, because some of them are very common. So you get the ampersand character frequently replacing an A, for instance. So if you know where that happens and what context it happened, then it's possible to write a script that will go through and clean things. But unfortunately, that attempt only really resulted in improvements of about 2% in the quality score. So you might be able to get something up from, say, 74% to 76% or something like that, but it wasn't really worth the effort that went into it. So in the end, it was more efficient simply to throw out the ones that were beyond repair.
But what Tony's saying. No, I'm saying what Tony's saying is it would be useful when we have the bar charts for what is in the corpus, is to actually also have the information for things that we found but are not in the corpus because they failed the conversion test, just to see whether it might be due to accident, to a bad printing season, but also to see what else there is out there that maybe in future, if we have a better conversion system, it could be added, because basically this corpus could be added to if we find more stuff that passes the threshold. That's it. We try to do that.
We probably do actually have the bar chart for our original collection, which we'd be able to compare. If I remember rightly, though, I don't think it was all that different from the cleaned one.
Right.
I mean, one thing that I would say about that is that the discovery among the pamphlets that were pulled out from the databases of the official list of anti-vaccination literature in the library of the LSACV was really really useful in hunting down things on various archives, but it did become
They basically
apparent.
had a vested interest in producing the longest possible list of
Yeah,
answers.
but there definitely is a lot of stuff to be had, but it became apparent that we don't have very much of it, really. So that there's definitely a lot of stuff which has either disappeared completely and will never be seen again, or is lurking in a drawer somewhere or in a text archive and hasn't yet made it into several of the many internet resources. So there's potential, certainly in the future, to expand it.
Any more questions? Here, there, and there. Okay.
I was just curious because I was the player of the Compulse project. Which tools did you use?
In the end, it was Adobe Acrobat. I'm handing over to Darren. Which tool did we use for OCR conversion?
We used quite a few.
The short version of the story, because you guys have no idea.
Yes, we used many online ones, some of which were very variable. There were some that were quite good, or they were good with some documents and not so much with others. The online ones mostly had size limits, or they could only be used for free for a certain amount of time, and then after so many submissions they wanted us to pay for them, and we just found that Adobe Acrobat was almost as good as any of them, and of course we have access to it. One thing Tony said about ink quality and so on in later 19th century newspapers, the other thing that drove me crazy in the late 19th century was the advent of double columned compositing. Single columned compositing is much easier. When you've got a double column, you get column read through, and you get this kind of scrambling effect. So that took some time to get sorted out.
So we had good experience with OCR for also making.
Okay, that's just good to know.
I'll try and go quickly so we get through the questions.
I try to comment quickly. So from our perspective, but what we heard this morning was that the VaDis was one of the most important efficacy strategies, especially for non-academic, non-learned advocacies. And would you say that for the whole prevention sector in medicine, someone missed to install a similar attractive or convincing efficacy strategy, because the story something happens and then nothing happens.
That's right.
Doesn't work out.
Yeah, no, so we've looked at this in the contemporary world. Basically, a pro-vaccination narrative, to make it tellable and involving, it ends up having to be about the disease you're preventing. So, and that's basically the only way you get a narrative, because uneventful vaccination doesn't make a good story. It's just simple as that. We've just seen it in contemporary material. So, whereas vaccine harms make great stories, and we've seen them here. So, I haven't looked at them here because these are anti-vaccination tests. But in the contemporary world on social media, the way in which people make good stories, for example, in favor of the HPV vaccine, is by telling very intimate details about their own experiences with cervical cancer. So they're about the disease, because otherwise, there are some people on Mumsnet where we've looked at that dramatize the successful vaccination, saying, oh, my daughter was really against it and she tried not to go to school, and then I bargained with her, etc., etc. So they dramatize the very mundane thing of persuading a kid to have a needle, and then she just had a sore arm for a couple of days. Not a great story, not a great story. So the pro-vaccination storytellers are at a disadvantage.
Okay.
I was very interested to see the political effects here, and you said there were several vaccination acts and so on. Was there any correlation, or could you in future look at a correlation between the degree of the anti-vaccination material and that? Because I think that has spin-offs for what we might do as against, for example, the very successful anti-fluoridation.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, so as I said, because what we have is potentially a random, in the sense that it's what has been preserved, what hasn't disappeared, and we can't assume that what has remained, what we still remains, reflects how much was produced. We cannot sort of say, okay, there are more texts this year because actually more texts were produced because people were objecting very strongly to something, as opposed to just by chance that year we have more texts preserved.
Well, there was more anti-vaccination material put out.
Yes, we cannot know precisely, although maybe from that catalogue we can, but certainly we can see the various arguments, especially, as I say, to do with fines, surfacing more when the legislation was changed. So there's definitely plenty that could be seen to be precise.
I suppose in time you might look at how these arguments link to or otherwise the Hazard debates, although they're not verbatim at that time.
Yes, but we can definitely look at that. And certainly in some ways, and here I'm speaking as a complete non-expert, more as a citizen, given that then smallpox was eventually eradicated and people were vaccinated even in England, in some ways making it compulsory creates so much trouble that you don't even know whether it's effective, because it's difficult, it raises issues of civil liberties. Then you've got to implement a policy of compulsory vaccination. How exactly do you do it? Then if you introduce punishments and penalties, how exactly do you administer those, etc., etc. So in a way, here we're seeing the fallout of a compulsory element in the context of England, in a particular sort of, philosophical and social context, that you think maybe it wasn't worth it. Because indeed, that by consent, smallpox was eradicated everywhere, including here. I know it's compulsory in some countries, but not here.
Great. In that case, I suggest we thank you both again. Have coffee and carry on talking to our own coffee.
Thank you.